Good afternoon, and welcome to Between the Pillars, the Fisher Library's video podcast series. My name is John Shoesmith, and I should say welcome to the special midweek podcast of Between the Pillars. If you watched the episode about a week and a half ago, where we profiled the University of Toronto archives, I did mention we were going to be taking a bit of a break and not record anything until the end of March. But with the state of the world as it currently is, with the devastating invasion of Ukraine by Russian forces, we decided to come back earlier than anticipated and have this special episode featuring my colleague at the University of Toronto Libraries, Ksenya Kiebuzinski. She is the head of the Petro Jacyk Resource Center, and she's also the Slavic Resources Coordinator for the libraries. And what we wanted to do here is celebrate Ukraine by looking at some of the Fisher's Ukrainian holdings. And really, there's no better person better positioned than Ksenya, who has been instrumental in helping us build up those resources and to promote those resources and to use those resources over the years. So thank you, Ksenya, for joining us. I know this has been a very difficult time for you over the last couple of weeks. Before we start showing some of the items that we have here that you've picked for us, maybe you can just talk a little bit about your connections to both Ukraine and the Ukrainian community here in Canada and abroad.
So I'm actually Ukrainian American, first generation. It's my parents and grandparents who came from Ukraine before it was in its current independent borders. My father was born in 1938, my mother in 1940. My dad was born in what was then Poland, and my mother was born in what was Soviet Ukraine, which
Right.
shortly in a few months became under Nazi control. And then they were small children, so they each fled with their parents with the invading Red Army in 1944 towards Western Europe. My mother and her parents ended up in a displaced persons camp in Feldkirch, Austria,
Right.
by way of Berlin, just before the bombing of Berlin, and they ended up in Austria and eventually immigrated to the US in 1949. And then my dad and his dad died actually in 1943. So it was just my dad and his mom went by way of Austria to Italy and then England and came to the US in the 50s. And
Right.
They raised me, not a super kind of patriotic nationalist, but just imbued in me the sense of love of culture and language and tradition. And I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. There was a small Ukrainian community, but active because so many Ukrainian immigrants, once the children grew up, they got, because of the language skills, ended up in a lot of governmental jobs.
Right.
So I spoke Ukrainian at home, went sometimes to church, was a member of a scouting organization and attended Saturday school to learn the language. I hated all of
Right.
that. But I decided to study French instead.
Okay.
So I zigzagged and didn't return to things Ukrainian until 1991, when after university and working as an archivist at the Archdiocese of Boston, there was an opening for a librarian position at the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University, and they needed someone who had archival skills and knew Ukrainian. So
Perfect.
And I reluctantly applied. I really didn't want to come back.
Right.
I was really determined to go along with my French studies and archival and special collections, but the rest is history.
So when did you come to University of Toronto?
I came here in July 2000, actually July 4th, 2006 was my first day of work. So it was my break with my US pass and my
Right.
embrace of Canada. So I've been here, I guess, about 16 years.
So, and it's interesting because I know you've recently done some research into the kind of collecting of the Slavic collections at the University of Toronto Libraries. Maybe just kind of give us a quick kind of overview of how that collecting has happened, particularly since I think you went back to about 1890 after the fire at the University of Toronto. So maybe just kind of give us the highlights of how the collecting has progressed over the years.
Right. No, it's, I mean, for one, I would say we have the largest and most kind of interesting collection of Slavic material in Canada, but that was not always the case. So my research was kind of a history of how did we get there, the collection that we have today, when did it start happening, and so I went through the acquisition ledgers that we have in the University of Toronto archives from 1890 to 1949, and I looked at every single line item.
I remember seeing you up there.
And I made an inventory of anything that we had that was in a Slavic or East European language, was on a kind of topic of Eastern European history in any language.
Mm-hmm.
Or was maybe donated by someone who seemed to have some connection to Slavic. And I'm glad I made those really big kind of parameters, because I wouldn't have had any data.
Right.
We honestly did not begin collecting until the mid 1940s.
Right.
Whatever we got were some translations of the major Russian writers, so like Tolstoy or Pushkin or Chekhov in English. Translations, there was some teaching. I was really disappointed because I thought James Mavor was the first connection to U of T with who was doing any kind of teaching on Russian history, political economics, and he had a massive library and papers. He was a friend of Tolstoy who visited him here at his home in Toronto,
Okay.
and helped facilitate the immigration of Dukhobors to the prairies. So I was sure that the library, I would find in the 20s, when he died in 1923, I would find, listings of his books that came to our library. But
Right.
But unfortunately, when I looked at kind of media, Toronto Star and other newspapers that existed, the library did not come to us. It went to Pomona College in California. Right. And actually the community here outside of the university was very upset about that.
I can imagine.
So, and that wasn't the Slavs, that was, just regular people. Right. How could we have let that go?
Right.
Yeah, so the collecting doesn't begin until there's a committee struck to investigate forming Slavic study. Actually, initially it was about Russian studies, and then the committee thought it was wiser to embrace fuller Slavic studies. Okay. So they hired this Bertram Shore in 1946, who came to build the program. And he had to not only build the program and teach, but he was also responsible for building the library collections out of nothing. Okay. And so that's when they started actually allocating the general library funds to Russian and East European studies. So there was a subject fund that was made, allocations, which went to departments back then. So it wasn't done at the library level. A department would build the library. Okay. And then, and then in the 50s, there started to be donations coming in. But the real impetus was when the Center for Russian East European Studies was created under H. Gordon Skilling, whose portrait hangs in the reading room here at Fisher. Yeah, it's a beautiful portrait. Yep. And that's when a lot of foundation grants came in to really, because they still were finding in 1963 that the collections were just not what they should be to support graduate studies. And then I would say also the chair of Ukrainian studies, when Paul Robert Magochi was appointed in 1980, was also a big driver of material coming in, and having a dedicated Slavic librarian, so Mary Stevens, who was hired with that whole cohort in the late 1960s, who in collection development.
So maybe let's talk specifically then about some of the holdings we have here, the Ukraine holdings here. at Fisher. Maybe tell us maybe the size of the scope, whether there's a particular collecting strength of the material that we have here at the Fisher Library.
Just to speak just of the Ukrainian, we have big collections of kind of archival materials. So there's the Peter Putichny collection on the insurgency and counterinsurgency in Ukraine. That was from the 1940s to 1950s, fighting for both Nazis and Russians. And once the Soviet Union took over Western Ukraine, they continued to fight until and weren't put out until in the mid 1950s.
Right.
So we have all sorts of documents there. It's huge, massive collection. I think it's something like 250 cartons, like big cartons, not little archival boxes.
I've seen them.
and we get a lot of researchers.
Yep. Oh, we do definitely
work with. And he continues to donate every year several, and I understand.
I think there's 20 more boxes downstairs right now, I think.
It came during the COVID. He made the trip here. We have some Rodion Kaluzhny archive. He was a monarchist, in emigration. So we have that kind of collection. We have Arkady Lyubchenko, who's a writer, his manuscripts. There's some diaries. The biggest collections are the two John Luchkiev collections. One is of the Displaced Persons collection, which is the largest, I believe, in anywhere. And we keep adding to it. So, and then there's the John Luchkiev Ukrainian Canadiana collection, which is anything in Ukraine and published before 1950. So those are big collections. We have the Ukrainian Millennium Old Book Collection, which is just 21 volumes that came in 1984 with the appointment of Professor Magochi, a community raised. So there were these religious church texts from the 16th, 17th, 18th century. So that's there.
We'll be showing one of those.
Yeah, and we'll be showing some stuff from the Luchkiev collections as well. And we also acquire kind of stray volumes that are, we do have a dedicated gift trust fund. So whenever anything interesting comes up, I have antiquarian dealers who are on the lookout for me. So I know I just ordered a few items that have come in or are coming in. So it's continuing to grow. Yeah.
Well, why don't we use this opportunity then to start showing some of the materials you pulled for us. You pulled about 8 or 9 items. Let me turn on the document camera. This one, we first had to lay it out because I didn't want to open it while we were on camera while I was sort of fumbling around with this. So maybe you could tell us what exactly we're looking at here.
That is a map of Ukraine. It's considered the first modern map of Ukraine. It was associated with Guillaume Levasseur de Beauplan, who was from France. He was a Huguenot who was invited by the Polish king, Sigismund III, to come to Polish Lithuania. And he spent 17 years there. And he actually described his experiences there. He was an engineer, a military engineer and a geographer and a cartographer. So this was the map is inserted in his description of Ukraine, and it's actually the way it was printed, it's kind of upside down.
Yeah, we were noting that before, that essentially, north is south and south is north here.
Yeah, so at the top is, so this kind of territory of Ukraine, of the lands of Ukraine, which are associated with the Cossack Hetmanate, and there's the image of 5 Cossacks down in the lower right-hand corner. Kind of stretches from, well, in this case, from Crimea in the north to territory that's now in northern Russia, where the invading forces are coming in, and then you have, okay, that's the right orientation, and then you have on the map Leopolis, which is the modern city of Lviv, and it stretches to in the east. To Siversky Donetsk, which is part of in the Donbass region. So in a way, it really kind of resembles the kind of map that we associate with Ukraine these days.
Right.
And,
so,
and,
and the
yeah,
date of this map is
1660.
okay.
Oh, actually, the first edition was in 1651, but it was so popular that it was reprinted.
Right.
1660, and it's been other cartographers copied this map. So there's a lot of variations of it.
Yeah, and it's great. It's, as I said, it's been inserted.
And yeah, and I should say this is from the Karl Godlewski donation from that it had belonged to his uncle,
Right.
Count Hutenshapsky, who was a big collector of all things Polonica.
Right.
So which was Luba Frostaki, our retired colleague, was instrumental in getting this collection here. And it's, while it's devoted to all things Poland, obviously there's a lot of overlap with Ukraine. So there are some gems for anyone interested in Ukrainian history or literature. There's a fabulous photograph album of Austrian Galicia of these Ukrainian Highlanders, the Hutzels, and drawings. And so it's a really fabulous collection. We're really lucky to have it.
So let me put this aside over here. And let's go to something a little bit different.
Smaller.
So, and this is actually from, maybe some people might be surprised, from our Voltaire collection. So there's Ukrainian connections even in some of these materials. So
yeah, and I don't know very much about how the Voltaire collection, all I know is it was a gift of Professor Harcourt Brown, and I don't know much more about it. But for many historians of Ukraine, this is a kind of I don't know if it maybe not necessarily important book, but one that gets quoted often. So it's the history of Charles XII, King of Sweden. And in the book, there's not a lot of pages, but there's a section devoted to Ukraine, and it's Hetman Ivan Mazepa. And it describes the kind of legendary story associated with Mazepa, who got caught in the Polish lords with a Polish lord's wife, and for punishment he was strapped naked to a horse, and the horse was, driven into the steppes of Ukraine. His body, he was alive, he was found, and he rose to become head of the Ukrainian Hetman state.
right.
And so in describing that kind of story, Voltaire, mentions that l'Ukraine a toujours aspiré à être libre, that Ukraine always had this drive to be free. And eventually Charles XII and Mazepa aligned to try to fight against Peter the Great's armies and Poltava in 1709, and that fails. But anyways, and you see there the following line that it was, surrounded by Muscovy.
Right.
And so here,
some things never change.
yeah, it seems, yeah. So that, and this book was, reprinted in hundreds of editions and translated. But that quote, I think it often ends up in politicians, in speeches at various ceremonial events will refer to that phrase. Well, that looks a lot nicer on camera.
Yeah, so we were admiring the gaudy nature of this ornate binding. What are we looking at?
Well, these are two bound gospels. The first one is from Holy Gospel printed in Kyiv in the Monastery of the Kievan Caves press, a very famous press, in 1746. And then there's also in the very back another gospel printed in Puchayev in the 18th century. But the reason, so this is from the Millennium Collection of Old Ukrainian Books that I had mentioned earlier. So it was a bunch of Ukrainians donated money to acquire these 21 books. So there is a book plate at the front where they're recognized for their support of the University of Toronto. But why I chose to have this show this was because it was in the library of the St. Michael's Golden Domed Monastery, which Stalin ordered to be razed in mid-1930s. And so that was destroyed. Parts of the monastery were from the 12th century, but maybe not so much. There were also mosaics from the 12th century, and some of them ended up in Moscow. Not all of them were saved. And there were also buildings that were from the 18th century, but it was rebuilt when Ukraine became independent. But when a lot of libraries from churches and various nobility were ransacked by the Soviet authorities and sold for need of cash to the West. So a lot of this kind of material ended up in libraries like Harvard or Columbia, New York Public Library, and even some here in the University of Toronto. So it's kind of the sad legacy of the destruction of culture that was.
Finding is just something else. It's even got its own thing.
And we need who was our binding specialist?
It was Philip.
Yeah, we need to get Philip back.
Okay, so let's go to.
And I should mention that the books were that came with this old Millennium Collection had once belonged to a Canadian-born but New York resident, Paul Fakula, who had like an 80,000 volume library in New York. And so we purchased these volumes from him. Oh yeah, this is a very charming little piece. So this item was hand inked and watercolored in an internment camp following World War I, where Ukrainians were held in a camp near Cassino, Italy. There were some tens of thousands of them there. And it's really a gorgeous little thing with all sorts of sketchings and towards the end. And so, yeah, and these prisoner of war camps in this case had fought for the Austro-Hungarian army, so defending Austria, and were interned. And this item came to us from by way of a professor at the University of Rutgers, Newark, Alexander Motil, who passed it on as a donation from the family that had owned it, who were Lubomir and Johanna Mudrecki, who had lived in Vienna and collected items associated with the kind of Ukrainian revolutionary movement, the Ukrainian seat. Oh yeah, these wonderful kind of advertising. So it's almost, it looks like a handwritten newspaper with, it's really
handsomely done.
It's really wonderful.
You think this might be something else, but maybe.
No, I don't know, but it's hard to tell. But I mean, it's obviously one of a kind item. And we do have a very large collection of Ukrainian revolutionary material. It's housed in the Andriy Zhuk. I didn't mention that earlier, but we have this Andriy Zhuk collection. And Andriy Zhuk was involved with the Revolutionary Ukrainian Party before World War I, and the Union for the Liberation of Ukraine. And the Union of Liberation of Ukraine kind of disseminated information to European capitals about Ukraine's independence movement during World War I and then the revolutionary years. And that collection ended up, the Andriy Zhuk collection ended up at the Library Archives in Ottawa. But they had a bunch of duplicate items. And so this is not one of them, but they gave us a bunch of about 200 volumes, which we've now digitized and made available. But as I get other material that fits into that time period, we add it to the Andreyshuk collection.
Okay.
Yeah, and this is another kind of unique document. It's a Canadian document published in Saskatoon. It's the Declaration of Ukrainian Canadians and Friends regarding Ukraine. There's a ethnographic map showing where Ukrainians lived in various territories. So it includes Galicia there, the Kuban, central Ukraine. And as you can see, the ethnic territories kind of, as is true of any nations, they overflow the borders in which they live. And this particular document was hoping to bring the Ukrainian question to the attention of the international community. And it was composed by a leader of the Ukrainian National Federation in 1938, hoping, to establish an independent Ukraine. Movement, obviously, the timing was not great because by 1938, Czechoslovakia was annexed and
Right.
all hope was lost.
But
But
pointing out too that this was all signed as well by the.
it's signed as well. So, and this is part of the John Luchky of Ukrainian Canadian collection. And I should say John Luchky was an immigrant from Austria, Galicia, Western Ukraine, and he was a displaced person who immigrated to Canada. He attended U of T and got degrees in mechanical engineering and applied sciences, but he loved collecting books. Yeah, this is another one from the same collection, and it's just basically, it's by the Mandrika, published in Winnipeg by the Canadian Ukrainian Educational Association, and it's kind of an account of the plight of Ukrainian refugees. Yes, and I think you pointed out that, uprooted humanity. So Mandrika was an activist, and he was trying to help provide relief for displaced Ukrainians who, were like my parents and my grandparents, who were uprooted from their homes, and to help them come to Canada. So I think about 35,000 Ukrainians immigrated to Canada immediately after World War II. Oh, yes, and this next item is a bit of a shout out to our Belarusian community. This is a periodical. We have a nice, healthy, long run. So it's called Naperad, or Forward, and there it says on the banner for the independence of our fatherland. And you have a young man dressed in traditional kind of Belarusian shirt, and it's a scouting magazine. We got a huge collection of Belarusian materials from the family of the son and daughter of Valentina and Michael Pashkevich, who were in Toronto, and they were big collectors of anything to do with Belarus. We got this in 2010, and it was a collection of about 3,000 items. A lot of it got integrated into the Robart circulating collection, and all the displaced person and kind of emigre material is now at the Fisher Library. And we have a lot of, as well, publications of displaced persons from Belarus.
This is sort of an odd item from our Kenny collection, which we wondered why it actually is in Kenny, which celebrates socialism and communism.
Yeah,
but very timely pamphlet.
Yeah, Moscow's Drive for World Domination, published in Toronto by the Free World Publishing Company in 1951. And it's just definitely anti-communist. Prihodko had been he was from Ukraine. He had been arrested by the NKVD. He had spent time as a forced laborer in Siberia until 1941. And in this book, he's really looking at Russian imperialism and messianism as being spread through the guise of communist humanitarianism. And, you can think of, that Russia's humanitarianly trying to save Ukrainians from the Nazi government led by a Jewish president. So, how this ended up in Kenny, unless we added it to the Kenny,
Yes.
that's possible, because sometimes the Fisher Library, we have core collections and we add. So, I would be curious how that made its way in.
Let's end with
This is my favorite item. This is a story that I read when I was a child, and I believe I have a copy of this at home. Bim Bom Zelen Bom. It's a children's story that was printed in Munich in 1949 by the publishing house for our children. Oh, that's so charming. And basically the story is about a cat whose house is on fire, and these chickens and chicks and roosters come running with pails of water to put out, to help the cat put the fire out. And the cat is also using a broom to try to, squash the flames, and they succeed in saving the cat's house. And they have a little, together. Poor cat has burnt its tail, so it's pouting and a little unhappy, but it all ends well, where they have a feast. And the cat and the rooster. And then there's this lovely moral, which to the story, which went over my head as a child.
Okay.
So it brought tears to my eyes when I read it last week when I was preparing for this podcast. So it's roosters, chickens, and chicks, and cats and kittens know how to save their native home or house when it's on fire. So you, my little children, learn how in your life to live in every peril to save your, native home, or the roof of your house, and we're, think about, and then it even has music to it, and I won't,
You won't sing it.
I won't sing it, but it's such a charming book. And there are a lot of lovely children's stories with these kinds of morals, but I think the kinds of, what we're seeing with all the country in flame, and seeing the heroics of people, standing up, who aren't armed,
Right.
elderly people just in flags trying to save their homes. It's really quite
It's
a
an
moving
apt
story.
metaphor.
Yeah.
So this has been great. I mean, ultimately, what do you, with the collections overall, I mean, what are they, is there particular collecting strength then in terms of the material we have here, the Ukraine material, or is it just really run the gamut of the various histories?
Well, we're building on, the strengths. So I would say it's maybe the Ukrainians in emigration. So with the displaced person collection, the Ukrainians in Canada, the Ukrainian revolutionary, because those pamphlets were largely published in the emigration in Prague and Warsaw and Sofia, Bulgaria. So it's that story of printing outside the territories of Ukraine. A lot of publications in Ukraine, pre kind of Soviet period or Stalin period, a lot of them got destroyed. But we do all, there were a lot of Ukrainians in the community here in Toronto and Canada who collected stuff, and you could buy these things. And I'm always still amazed to go on house visits to potential donors and to see how much more unique material to our collections there is still out there.
Right.
So it's my favorite part of my job is, going out and meeting people with libraries. They value them so greatly. And I'm so glad that when we can have a safe home for these books. And I would also say that the Fisher Library also has excellent collections documenting generally kind of human rights issues
Right.
in Eastern Europe. So starting with the Prague Spring of 1968 and the Gordon Skilling collections, we have two related to that. We have, the Petlice collection. We have the Solidarity, the Polish Solidarność collection. We have Russian Samizdat collection, the Putnichny insurgency. So that we do have a lot of, and I think that's something to bear in mind, that we have been kind of building a core on these kind of issues of independence movements, freedom to speak.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is an important message right now. So anyway, Ksenia, this has been really great. I mean, we kind of feel helpless here when we're thousands of kilometers away from the atrocities that are going on, but at least we can do a little bit here to show, the strength and the pride really of these publications and the Ukrainian people. I'm also going to put in the show notes a list of organizations as well where you can donate money to help the cause, because obviously this is such an extremely important issue and time right now. So again, Ksenia, thank you for this very special.
Thank you, John. It was my pleasure. I feel like, as a librarian, what do I know how to do? And this is one thing I know I can do.
Yes, and the pride too. You talk about this material that we have is important. So, and we encourage people, encourage people to come and look at this material as well. It's here for the community. It's here for the community to look at. So, so again, Ksenia, thanks again. We will be back in 2 or 3 weeks' time. Not sure what we're going to be doing in 2-3 weeks' time, but please join us again for another episode of Between the Pillars. And until then, thank you. See you soon.